Okay, so this unit activity is all about chemical reactions, and our main objective here is to evaluate energy resources and come up with a plan to manage them in our community. So that involves a short research project where we answer a question and explore more about the topic. And then we also have multimedia and visual displays to clarify claims. And we're going to try to make a presentation about these chemical reactions and resources. So getting into the introduction, we have fossil fuels, and they are our main sources of energy. And these fossil fuels go through combustion, and combustion is a chemical reaction. A lot of these energy sources are abundant, but they're not renewable necessarily. And they're inexpensive once we harness the energy and make it usable for humans. But the catch is they're non-renewable and they hurt the environment if we're using too much of them for too many things, right? You see this over-reliance on these energy sources, and that can have a negative effect. An alternative energy source they're talking about in this unit activity is called biomass, or another word for that is biofuel. And it's a lot like fossil fuels. It still has that combustion reaction, but it's renewable as it's using plants and plant waste as fuel instead of those petrochemicals and oil, natural gas. So we're going to explore how those fossil fuels harm the environment, and then look at whether biomass is a good alternative. Should we use a bit of both? Use biomass for as many things as we can, and then for larger projects, use some of those fossil fuels, but just stop over-relying on them. So we're going to explore some of those ideas today. And if you were put in charge with deciding which renewable energy source to develop for your city or town, which would you choose? So we're going to do some research, and then at the end, hopefully you'll be able to have a better understanding of which one would work for Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? And ideally, we're going to try to develop a 10 to 15 slide presentation and answer those questions throughout the presentation. It says option to deliver it. We're not going to deliver the presentation. We're just going to research, find some good pictures and visuals, and then try to put all that in a good looking PowerPoint presentation, or Google Slides is what we'll be using today. So here's what I'm going to be looking for in the presentation. So planning and creating a presentation, as long as you're doing these things, you're good to go. So you're summarizing what you already know about the topics. You're looking for credible resources where you can tell me where you found that information. Write down an initial idea about which energy sources to develop and provide reasons. You're going to come up with which energy source, and then tell me why. Tell us why. That's a good option for us. And when you're creating these types of presentation, you want to start out with a rough outline. It doesn't have to be in detail, but you kind of want to know where you're going. Provide a rough map, and then as you research and put the pieces together, it'll come together more naturally. And then compile 2 to 3 audio and video resources that you would like to use in the presentation. So I'll show you some videos, where to find them. YouTube, always great. So we'll definitely be using some of those. And then actually building that presentation in Google Slides is the last thing I'll be looking for. So let's get started in the task. Planning and creating a presentation. So if you need help with research, they always include this research process, and it's a good step-by-step guide for going about research. If you don't have any idea what to do, or you're feeling a little lost, this is a good process to go back to, and just remember, it's not as hard as it initially seems. As long as you follow these steps, you'll end up with a pretty good presentation. And it doesn't have to be perfect. I know you're busy, you got other classes going on, but I think if you follow the process and show me, yeah, this is what I know, this is what I researched, and if you're showing me that you're able to do that pretty well, you'll be getting a good grade. That's what we're looking for. As long as you're interacting with the information, you know where to find it and how to put it all together, that's great. So part A gives you a list of questions that will help you with your research, and it's under each topic. So the bold is the topic, and then you have 2-3 questions under each topic. And that's a really good way to structure that presentation. So each topic could be a slide, and then on that slide, you're answering these questions. So you have chemical reactions of fossil fuels, difference between the biomass and the fossil fuels, comparing biomass with other renewable energy sources. So you're comparing biomass, fossil fuels, and then you're comparing biomass and renewables. And then lastly, you're making that final recommendation about, all right, well, Oklahoma, it's not by large bodies of water, so maybe not use hydropower. That wouldn't be the main source, really. But we have plenty of wind, right? We get sun, and there's plenty of plant waste around Oklahoma that you could use as alternative energy resources. So those are 7 questions, and then you can easily take those and make that about 10 slides. So first slide is a title. The next slide is introducing the topic, and then bam, 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 answering these 7 questions, each with their own slide, and you got a presentation. Part B is focusing on sources and what makes things credible. And ideally, science shouldn't show bias, but humans, we have our little human brains, and a lot of the time we are biased in our views. So the nice thing about science is you have groups of people discussing a topic. One will do a study, another person will try to recreate that study, and if there's any differences, they talk it out, right? And the more you have that, there's going to be less bias if multiple parties are involved and they're all researching the same topic and they're trying to be as unbiased as possible. Of course, you have people, when there's money involved, there's going to be a potential for bias. So generally you want to stick to sites that have .gov behind them, not a lot of advertisements, or they're not trying to sell you energy products, because of course they would be like, well, you should buy our energy product and we use this energy resource to get that. So you got to watch out for that bias. And some good questions to review a source are listed here. So who wrote the article? Why do they care? What are they trying to say? Are they a scientist? Do they know a lot about chemistry? Or are they a business person or just some guy down the street, right? You gotta kind of see who's saying what, where they're coming from, and what they're trying to say. What is the purpose of the article? Does the article state facts that scientists can prove with evidence? And you want to stay away from really opinionated stuff. So people that will say things and then they just run with it without really backing it up with science or numbers, right? So if someone's really passionate about something and they're like really intense and they're writing, or they got a video and they're speaking, you know, that's great that you're passionate about something, but what would strengthen your argument is trying to look at the facts, right? Using scientific research and then drawing conclusions from the research. That's just going to be a more solid argument versus you just telling me how you feel or what you think, right? So in science, you need to tie it to evidence and logic and numbers that we can verify with ourselves or other scientists can verify. So if one group of scientists says this, but another group of scientists says something else, there's something there that you need to research further. And if you're running into several sources that are saying the same thing or similar things, there's a good chance that that information is reliable. It's not perfect though, but there's a good chance that it's a solid group of information or set of ideas for you to use. So here are some of the examples. I'll put them in the chat. See everyone. But they're also available in the Edmentum lesson we have here. So we got one about the biomass, liquid fuels from biomass. This is from the NREL, and they have, this is from their energy basics section. So it's talking about biomass, but there's also geothermal, hydrogen, hydropower, marine energy, solar, that's a big one, wind, and I think that's it. The others more transportation and zero energy buildings. Interesting, but not directly related to what we're talking about right now. So I'll put that one in there too. And then the last one is from forests and rangelands. Okay, so those are three decent resources that we'll use for now. And then part C is encouraging you to take notes from the sources we've just identified. So we picked those three sources, and then we're trying to answer these questions or try to talk about the main points for each topic. And we have more resources here in part C, talking about the combustion of fuels, crude oil, hydrocarbons, and alkanes. We also have how much carbon dioxide is produced from US gasoline and diesel fuel consumption. Oops, let's get that out of the way. Acid rain. What is acid rain? And what causes acid rain from the EPA? How is it measured? So on and so forth. Biomass. From Kids Corner. How we use biomass, burning, fermentation, conversion, bacterial decay. Biodiesel. From Brown University. And then one more, sources of energy from Energy for Me, Essential Energy Education. Okay, talking about renewables and non-renewable energy. And using the 3 sources here, and then the sources they give you in part C, you're trying to come up with a main point for each topic. And I'll show you the main point examples from Edmentum. Zoom in a little bit. But the first one, chemical reactions of fossil fuels. We're talking about combustion. And when there's combustion, it releases CO2 into the air. And we know CO2 contributes to climate change. We studied the greenhouse gas effect, and the more greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere, they act as a mirror, a glass, where a lot of the heat that would escape into the atmosphere is redirected into our atmosphere back towards Earth, and that gradually warms up our global temperature. And when that happens, you get all of these bizarre effects like extreme weather, drought, flooding, and all of those things have an effect on how humans live and how the animals and our environment exist. So if things are flooded or areas are really dry, animals will die, plants will die, and that affects the entire ecosystem, and that affects how we can survive as well. And then we also have acid rain is tied to coal production and burning coal. A main point for difference between biomass and fossil fuels. They're both burned and combustion takes place, but biomass is renewable while fossil fuels are not. That's the key difference between biomass and the fossil fuels. Comparing biomass with other renewable energy sources. So you compared biomass and fossil fuels. Now you're comparing biomass with other renewables. And although biomass releases some CO2, it's similar in that regard. Biomass is more abundant and inexpensive than most of the other alternative energy sources or choices, they say. So combustion takes place, there's CO2 released. However, it's abundant and expensive if you're comparing it to some of those alternative energy choices. Making energy choices locally. Well, here in Oklahoma, this also applies, but you can use waste products from the area's farmland for biomass. You can also generate electricity and power vehicles using biomass. Open land and windy conditions in the area make wind power a decent choice, a good choice for electricity production. And wind is one of the fastest growing renewables out there. And it has a really minimal effect on the environment. And once everything's built and you're just maintaining those structures, it's fairly affordable too. Okay, so those are the main points. And then we'll take these main points, maybe change them up a little bit, but we'll create an outline to organize the presentation. And the guideline here is following the 5-paragraph essay and include an introduction and a works cited page. So here is the outline. Let me see if I can copy paste that into the chat. Ta-da. Let me know if that shows up funky, but that's all in there. But I'll quickly run through, and you would treat each topic or header as a slide and sometimes two. So you could, if there's too much words, too many words, and too much information on a slide, you can always just add another slide right after it. So maybe you have the introduction, you have the title slide, the introduction, and you're trying to hook the listener into the topic, get them interested. Why should they care? Why do you care, right? And then you want to state the topic. What's the point of the presentation? So those are the first few slides, and then you're getting into describing the problem with fossil fuels. Why are we even considering alternative energy resources? Well, with fossil fuels, remember, you have the CO2 emitted during combustion reactions, and they affect the environment because these are greenhouse gases, and they add to climate change. Impurities in coal react in the atmosphere to form acids. That's where acid rain comes from. And then fossil fuels finally are non-renewable. So we have the CO2, we have the acid rain, and then we have the non-renewable nature of these fossil fuels. And once you describe the problem with fossil fuels and why do we care about looking for alternatives, you can talk about biomass as an alternative fuel. And why is it better than fossil fuels? Well, it has reduced CO2 emissions. There's still CO2, but there's less than fossil fuels. And there's no acid rain if you're using biomass. It's renewable and it's using waste. So that's another interesting part of biomass, is you're recycling things that are already being created. There's already plant waste and animal waste, right? So now you're recycling it and using energy, and it becomes useful. New technologies are in development to more easily convert biomass to fuels, such as biodiesel. So we have technology, and it's getting more and more developed where it is possible to use biomass and scale that up, right? Sure, you could use it on the small scale, but what you really want is to allow people to use these things and sustain our energy sector much more prominently than those fossil fuels. So we want to use fossil fuels less and use those alternatives more, and that will be a sustainable way for us to exist. And then after you're talking about biomass, because that's the one they're really focusing on in this lesson, you can also talk about renewable energy sources. So you have biomass, right? And then you have wind power, hydropower, which is water, solar power, and then geothermal power. Provide local recommendations for choosing and developing renewable energy sources in the area. Okay, so that's the part that will be the most different in all of your presentations. Since you're looking at Oklahoma, Tulsa, you're trying to find out what would suit Oklahoma the best, and then try to back that up with some information and sources. And then you have your conclusion. So that was part D. There's the outline. Now it gets you started. And then in part E, you're looking for pictures to present the information in a more interesting way, I'd say. Is the last thing you want in a presentation is just words on the screen. You need some of those pictures and illustrations to keep people engaged and present the information in a different way. Ideally, you would be speaking and talking about facts and figures, as well as showing those facts and figures and trying to connect these ideas for people. And sometimes the ideas are better suited for talking it out, or you have visuals to show them what's going on. So here are some examples. This one's about the CO2 and the recent global monthly mean of CO2. So they're averaging out CO2 monthly across the globe. And as you see, it's increasing. From 2012, it was about 392 parts per million. And then at this point, I believe this is 2016, it's at 404-ish parts per million. And that was only over 4 or 5 years. Here's Biomass Basics. So this is a really simple, clear way to tell your audience the types of biomass. You have garbage, crops, alcohol fuels, landfill gas, and finally wood can also be used as biomass. And then lastly, you have an acid rain illustration or visual, and it shows you the steps of acid rain production. So first you have the emissions from this plant, the coal plant. It enters the clouds. The pollutants are transformed into acid particles, and those particles can travel long distances. And then those acid particles that are in the clouds fall to the earth as wet and dry deposition. So that can be dust, rain, snow. And then after it's falling to the earth, it may cause harmful effects on our soils, our forests, our streams, and lakes. So those are good visuals for your presentation. Something about CO2, something about biomass, something about acid rain. And then if you wanted to add more for the other alternatives, you could do that as well. And then in part F, you're trying to put all the things you're finding into the presentation. So I say aim for 10 slides. So that would include the title, the intro, the problems with fossil fuels. You're talking about combustion. You're also talking about acid rain. So you could make that about 5 slides already. The intro, the title, the intro, the problem with fossil fuels, combustion, acid rain. So that could be 5 right there. And then you're talking about biomass, and you're comparing biomass to fossil fuels, comparing biomass to alternative energy resources as well, the renewables like solar, hydropower, wind, geothermal. And then you can also talk about the pro cons of each energy source. And then 9, you're trying to recommend what Oklahoma should do. So talk a bit about which energy source is the best suited for Oklahoma and why. And then you have your summary. So that's about 10 slides that I would suggest. I will show you a basic way to do that right now. So this is from something else. Let me pause. And then start a new Google slide. I'll show you how pretty quickly you can create a presentation and then just fill it in with information from your research. Here we go, new Google Slides. Okay, here we go. So I clicked new Google Slides in Google Drive, and now we have just a really basic Google slide printout. And you can click different designs, and that can make things look pretty good, even though you're not doing anything, right? It like already looks sciencey and professional. So work smarter, not harder when it comes to these PowerPoint presentations. I'll just go with the simple, dark, classic presentation, but you can just call it chemical reactions, unit activity, by student name. Bam, you got the title. Then you got the intro. And you're talking about the problem, fossil fuels. Here you can talk about CO2 emissions. And then let's go back to the outline. So let's copy and paste some of these questions. So you're trying to answer those questions. There we go. The problem with fossil fuels, we're talking about the CO2 emissions, acid rain, and how it's non-renewable. And here you can insert some pictures about acid rain. How about just copy and paste some of the photos in there just for fun. Right click, copy. Now you got this. Then you can slide to the side, make it look nice. Say the problem. Fossil fuels continued. Talk about acid rain. And then once again, you don't have to use these pictures, but I'm just going to use. You can find your own cooler pictures online and then make it more personal, give your own style, and then talk a bit more about acid rain, talk a bit more about CO2, and you already have 4 slides. So good to go. Then we're talking about biomass. And an alternative to fuels. Biomass compared to other renewable resources. And then here, you could insert a chart of comparisons like we did here. So we could, if you've ever used the clipping tool or the snipping tool, you can just go like that, copy. I'm just going to use the examples from the presentation here. Then copy. There you go. Cool. So yours won't look exactly like this, but pretty similar. Just sort of position it so it's readable. But you want to have something about the energy source, what's good about it, what's not so great about it. And then local recommendations for Oklahoma. So here you can talk about Oklahoma and its current energy resource use. And then maybe on another slide, what alternatives can Oklahoma use instead of fossil fuels? And if you know stuff about Oklahoma, we're very big, used to be a very big oil producer, and now we're a very big natural gas producer. So there's a lot of interest here in maintaining the use of fossil fuels. However, over time, we generally want to use more of these alternative and renewable resources and back off those fossil fuels for most energy use. There's debate about totally getting rid of fossil fuels, or if we're just hitting the brakes and not using them for local communities and things of that sort. But that's not what we're really talking about today. Today is just creating a really simple presentation about here are problems with non-renewable resources. Here's biomass, here's other renewable resources, and then which ones are good for Oklahoma. So here you could talk about, oh, wind's really good. Oh, we also have a little bit of hydropower potential too. Solar, pretty good too. Biomass. And then you want to pick one. One of those, one or two probably. It's okay if you can't pick one. And then you'll sort of just summarize everything at the end. So one sentence about non-renewable energy sources. Biomass. Alternative. Oh, why did I not cut this? Alternative. Other alternatives. Oklahoma recommendation. And that's it. Okay. So that's a very basic outline of a presentation. And then, of course, you want to make it look a little prettier, give it your own style. But here you have chemical reactions, unit activity by student. Introduction, hook them in with the topic, state the topic. Then you have the problem with fossil fuels, talking about CO2, talking about acid rain. And then you get into biomass as an alternative to fossil fuels, add some pictures, of course, compare biomass to fossil fuels, and then compare it to other renewable, have some type of chart showing what's good about some of these sources, what's not so good. And then finally make a recommendation for Oklahoma, and then summarize the whole thing in your last slide. And that should get you about 10 slides or so. If you're a little under, no big deal. But I think that is a good way to structure the presentation. And then you'll just attach it to the Edmentum unit activity, and then I can look through it and then grade it. Yeah, as long as you're showing me that you're researching and you're able to look through information and then put it in a Google slide, you will get a good grade for this course activity, unit activity. So don't get too stressed about it. But hopefully that helped you kind of work through what to do, how to go about doing so. And then, yeah, that's about it for the chemical reactions unit activity. Does anybody have any questions before we leave for the day?